Good evening. Welcome to Northbeat. I'm Megan Roberts. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada is calling for changes after an investigation into a deadly helicopter crash in Nunavut in 2021. The helicopter went down near Resolute Bay after taking off from a remote camp. All 3 people on board were killed. Investigators say some of the recommendations they're making today are the same ones they've been making for decades. Jody Nyocha has the story.
The pilot and the helicopter were not prepared to handle the weather that contributed to a fatal crash in 2021. That was the finding of the Transportation Safety Board, which released the findings earlier today. The April 25, 2021 crash caused the death of 3 people, 2 passengers and a pilot. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada found that the pilots were not equipped with the proper operating procedures and the helicopter did not have the technology to safely navigate the whiteout conditions at the time of the crash. Kathy Fox is chair for TSB.
Every accident is a result of many factors, and they are often preventable, and this one was no exception. The safety deficiencies that we will highlight today are not new. Unfortunately, for more than 30 years, the TSB has been calling for the implementation of safety measures to mitigate the risks that persist in helicopter reduced visibility operations.
4 recommendations stem from that investigation. They include improved training, enhanced operating procedures, and upgrades to technology. Daryl Collins is the investigator in charge for Transportation Safety Board.
And one of the other challenges specifically operating up there during the winter months and the spring is that you have very few references available because you have no trees up there, you're above the tree line. And then when you get into situations where you've got snow-covered ground with very little to look at on the surface, and then you have some clouds on top and you add some snow in there, it creates a very dangerous recipe that can create these conditions.
Fox said she is hopeful Transport Canada will act on the recommendations. Jody Nyocha, CBC News, Iqaluit.
Natural disasters affected communications in the north last year, sometimes right in the middle of emergencies. In the Northwest Territories, it happened in Hay River during the wildfires. In the Yukon, it happened near Dawson during flooding. Now, the Yukon government has a backup plan. It says if flooding wipes out communication networks, it'll have Starlink at the ready as soon as this spring. The satellite-based system is capable of delivering high-speed internet to remote areas. The Yukon government says setting up Starlink in the Klondike Valley is a priority. The floods in the area last year caused a communication blackout for some residents, a problem some Dawsonites accuse the government of failing to plan for. Shane Skarnalis is the Yukon government's emergency planner. He says Starlink will address those concerns.
In a perfect world, we will have a federal government sponsored and paid for Starlink system in every community at the common rally points or sheltering centers, so that if we do lose the fiber line, we can have these rally points pre-identified. We can get messaging out.
Skarnalis says the Yukon could get between 3 and 10 systems, but he says that's all pending further talks with counterparts in Ottawa. Skarnalis says those officials will be in the territory next month to solidify plans. But he says at least one system is in the mail for Dawson. There's a battle brewing over whether or not to hold a public inquiry into the 2023 NWT wildfire season. Some MLAs and Dene leaders in the territory say it's a must, but the NWT premier says it's not the right move. So what does a public inquiry look like in this context? For that, we've reached Wally Oppal. He's the former Attorney General of BC and has led multiple public inquiries, including into the police investigation of serial killer Robert Pickton. Wally, first of all, do you think it makes sense to do a public inquiry into this past wildfire season?
Well, there's a number of factors that need to be considered. A public inquiry is an investigation. It's an investigation as to what happened, what the reactions were, and were there any mistakes made? What did we learn from it? Those are some of the factors that you have to think about. Now, I was involved in the Pickton inquiry into missing and murdered women. In that case, Pickton, a serial killer, had preyed upon sex trade workers, and he took them back to his farm and he murdered them. There were lots of answers as to why, or lots of questions as to why the police were not able to apprehend him for about 10 or 15 years. The public was outraged. So the government appointed me to conduct an inquiry. The purpose of the inquiry was to find out what happened. Why did it take the police so long to catch Picton? So we held a public inquiry, which is an independent process wherein people came forward and testified. There's public participation. So that's what makes the process so credible. It is independent and it is participation. It's participatory because members of the public get involved in it. And in the Northwest Territories now, as I understand it, the Dene Nation and others are calling for an inquiry to find out what happened. And that's probably a good idea, to find out what happened, what mistakes were made, how can we correct those mistakes in the past. So it's important that you hear from the public. On the other hand, you do have to think about matters such as costs, expense. You know, governments don't have unlimited resources, so cost is important. But it's a part of a democracy such as Canada to be involved in these public inquiries, to find out what important issues took place and how can we avoid mistakes if there were mistakes made here.
I mean, you talked about the cost, and that was one of the big concerns from the Premier in the NWT, who argued that an inquiry into the wildfires would not only be too expensive, but very large in scope. And he mentioned that, you know, people can be called to testify, and that could potentially, because the wildfire and the multiple evacuations involved so many people, that could make it into this really big event that would cost a lot of money. What do you make of that argument against an inquiry from the Premier?
Well, that's a major concern. But, you know, when the government appoints someone to do an inquiry, they have a timeline and they have definite, discrete questions as to what to be answered. So the commissioner or commissioners that are appointed to conduct an inquiry should be in a position where they can put a time limit on the inquiry. And also there's a budget. So the budgets are not unlimited, but I can tell you that the Picton inquiry, which was huge, it involved many people coming forward. We had over 50 days of evidence. We had public participation, over 100 witnesses, and we learned a lot. It cost less than $10 million. So I think that was worth it for the damage that was caused, the heartbreaks that resulted from the women that were murdered by Picton. So you have to think of the public interest, and you need to know what happened so that you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So I think that everybody concerned believed that it was well worth the cost. The difficulty with the government investigating itself, it may be a good inquiry, may be valid, but it's the perception of lack of independence. And that's a factor that needs to be considered. Canada's had a long history of public inquiries, and much is learned from the inquiries so as to avoid mistakes that are made.
I mean, you touched upon the role of an inquiry in restoring public trust, and that is one of the things that has been brought up in this conversation in the Northwest Territories right now, is that an inquiry could help restore public trust and really increase transparency into the whole process. So in your experience, you spoke a little bit about this, but does an inquiry achieve those goals of restoring public trust and having transparency?
Well, it has every possibility of doing that. And that's why you want an independent inquiry, because it involves the participation of the public. The public has questions. The public's input is very valuable. And for that reason, if the public is allowed to participate in the process, and the process is independent of government, then you have a good and fair process. And that's important. Right now, I see that there are many questions that are being asked, particularly the Dene Nation, I notice, is concerned about this. And there are many questions, not too many answers. And the public is concerned, lots of public criticism. So for those reasons, it may be useful to hold an inquiry. Again, I'm not trying to second guess the Premier and the government. They have a responsibility to ensure costs are kept under control. So those are factors that need to be considered. There's a balancing exercise, but I think on balance here, it may be useful from the perspective of public confidence to have an inquiry where there are so many questions that are being posed, particularly from credible people like the Dene Nation.
Okay, Wally, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this matter. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Daniel Hodon is a free man. Today, in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court of Canada restored his acquittal in the 2017 death of a man in Apex, Nunavut. Hodon was tried for second-degree murder in the death of Bradley Windsor. He was initially acquitted in 2021, but the Nunavut Court of Appeal quashed the verdict and ordered a new trial in 2022. Hodon appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing the Court of Appeal didn't have a legal basis to overturn the acquittal.
We're thrilled with the result, but it was the right result. Now Dan's vindicated. It's unfortunate that he had to have his case drag on this long, but he's been vindicated and there's no right for the Crown to appeal, and the acquittal is now fully restored.
The Supreme Court said it'll provide reasons for its decision at a later date. Inuvik RCMP have busted more crack dealers in town. This past Sunday, officers completed a search warrant at a local apartment building. While police are happy to have gotten drugs off the street, the staff sergeant in Inuvik says it's also important to help those who are struggling with addiction. Jesse Aubin says drug dealers could be put out of business if demand falls.
You know, I go back to that showing compassion to those that are struggling and reaching out to them to see what kind of help you can give. It's not an easy answer. There's a lot of communities in Canada that are struggling with substance use issues, and the RCMP's role obviously is the enforcement and the disrupting those that benefit from that.
2 apartments were searched in connection with the same suspects. 60 grams of crack cocaine, $750 in cash, and other paraphernalia were all seized. 4 people have been charged in connection with the searches. 2 are from Inuvik and 2 are from British Columbia. Elders and youth from across Canada are in Whitehorse this week talking about justice. They're at the 4th Exploring Justice Our Way conference. The conference looks at ways to include more traditional and spiritual laws, and it also examines how to move away from a one-size-fits-all justice system. The Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations says equality needs to be at the heart of the conversation.
I think it's critical now that we not only build these systems into place, but that we reflect on where this territory is going to ensure that we don't lose those values that have once guided us and still continue to, hopefully today, as much as we'd like to. So.
The conference is also looking at Indigenous victim services, as well as the Federal Indigenous Justice Strategy Plan. For one hopeful moment, a bridge connecting Dawson and West Dawson seemed like a reality. But those dreams were quickly dashed when the real situation became clear. Turns out it was all a case of miscommunication. Rafsan Farouk Jugal explains.
Remarks by the Prime Minister of Canada and Parliament are causing confusion.
Our approach to infrastructure continues to be one of investing in the future for Canadians. Through the National Trade Corridors Fund alone, we're building projects like a new bridge over the Yukon River in Dawson City.
But that bridge over the Yukon River is not in the works, says the Yukon government. The mix-up happened with the Nisutlan Bay Bridge project in Teslin. The Prime Minister's office says that in 2021, $135 million was awarded to the government of Yukon through the National Trade Corridor Fund. Part of this funding was supposed to go to a proposed bridge in Dawson City. Later in 2022, the Yukon government requested that the fund be used to rebuild the Nisutlan Bay Bridge in Teslin. Member of Parliament for the Yukon acknowledged the error.
There's no bridge for Dawson City. There was just a mix-up between the Dawson City Bridge project and the Sutherland Bridge project in his speaking words. So
everything remains the same?
Everything remains the same. We're continuing to build infrastructure and roads in the north, going right ahead. But the Sutherland Bay Bridge is the big project going on right now.
The official opposition in the Yukon Legislative Assembly is not happy. They point fingers at the territorial and federal governments.
It's almost comical, I guess. It's just a classic case of confusion with not only the federal Liberal government, but the territorial Liberal government as well. I mean, we see the Prime Minister using his speaking notes, and he's got the wrong town, the wrong river, wrong highway. I mean, the only thing he's got right is that he's talking about the Yukon.
The Federal National Trade Corridor Fund website still says that money has been allocated for a bridge in Dawson City. That bridge will not happen because a majority of surveyors in Dawson City are pleased with the options they have in crossing the Yukon River, says the territorial government. A Yukon government spokesperson says that they have been trying to get their federal counterparts to update the website with the correct information since last year. Rob Sanfarag-Jugo, CBC News, Whitehorse.
When my grandfather, Charlie Chaplin, first arrived in Hollywood, it was a place of dreams. But my grandfather clashed with some very powerful forces in America.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Stand away from the stand!
I'm Una Chaplin. This is Hollywood Exiles. It's about a war of ideas that tore apart friendships, ended careers, and affected families like mine.
Hollywood Exiles, available now on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Innovatum contest is open. You can read, speak, sing, or do a skit in the dialect of your choice. And you can even use filters like this one. Una nutchuk. Buvraganeaktuk. This is a seal. It's going to swim.
Bad hair days. We all have them.
Even as scientists.
I think I know my place. It's not making art.
What? This is a whale? That's incredible.
I'm piloting a boat in the fjords of Norway. I love this job.
This week marks 10 years since the death of university student Loretta Saunders. The Inuk woman was writing a thesis on missing and murdered Indigenous women when she herself was killed in Halifax. A vigil was held in Happy Valley Goose Bay to honor her memory, but also to celebrate her successes. The CBC's Heidi Adder has that story.
That's Loretta Saunders' cousin, performing a drum dance in her memory. At just 26, Saunders had experienced her share of obstacles, had overcome addiction. She was studying criminology, was an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
I just want everybody to remember the passion that she had, the beautiful life that she had before it was taken from her, and kind of the legacy that she left behind.
A legacy cut short. Saunders struggled growing up in Happy Valley Goose Bay. She left high school and for a time lived on the streets in Montreal. Watching how Indigenous women were treated sparked a drive for change. Returning home, she was accepted to St. Mary's University in Halifax, where she was working on a thesis about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
She was going to make a change, and she done a pretty good job, but in her little short life.
Her mother says the family warned her to be careful, but says Loretta's nature was to help, to trust others. Saunders was killed after showing up to collect late rent payments from a couple subletting her Halifax apartment. She was murdered on February 13th, 2014. The search for Saunders captured the country's attention. Her death sparked national movements, with vigils in Halifax, Labrador, and Ottawa. She inspired the Am I Next campaign, highlighting the troubling statistics that Indigenous women are 4 times more likely to be murdered than any other woman in Canada. Her death amplified calls for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, with her family addressing the commission. Her former university launched an Indigenous Affairs Advisory Council, created a scholarship in her memory, and her younger sibling DM, formerly known as Delilah, advocated for change until their early death in 2021, winning an international award for their work. This vigil marks 10 years since Loretta Saunders' death, but her cousin says she should never be forgotten.
Really, it is a celebration of Loretta. And to also raise awareness with her story, it's very important to me. It's important to my family. It's something that we have fought for before. So I think it's important to keep the story going.
Newman was just 9 when her cousin was killed, but is working to continue the family's advocacy. The words, "Am I next?" written on her drum.
It kind of represents more of the internal anger, more of the internal hurt, rather than, going out and yelling at everybody in the room. It's kind of a quiet protest, and I want my drum and my drumming to be a quiet protest.
Newman was inspired to go into mental health and addictions, joining others in her family that are continuing Saunders' hope of a safer future for Indigenous women and girls. Heidi Adder, CBC News, Happy Valley, Goose Bay.
There's growing concern that dwindling sea ice is pushing some polar bears close to starvation. Using cameras and GPS, researchers effectively traveled with the bears as they searched for food. And as Nicole Motorlero reports, they call what they saw alarming.
Long regarded as an icon of the North, polar bears now face ever bigger challenges from declining sea ice in a rapidly changing climate. A new study led by the U.S. Geological Survey reveals what some are up against. Using high-res color cameras that allowed researchers to almost see through the bears' own eyes. They tracked 20 of them near Churchill, Manitoba, to see how they fared with less sea ice. Forced to spend more time on land means hunting and eating fewer fatty seals, the bears' main food source, resulting in significant weight loss and drops in energy levels. The study found that without those crucial calories, some bears chose to do very little, practically hibernating and living off their fat reserves, while others tried to feed off berries, plants, or birds. One bear even swam a total of 175 kilometers in Hudson Bay, resting briefly on the floating carcass of a beluga whale she tried to eat. But overall, the food the bears consumed didn't make up for the energy they spent while foraging.
I think what our study was really getting at was what are the limitations to polar bears' ability to adapt. And I think that's what we found was that they had all of these different behaviors and a lot of energetic strategies, and none of that was able to prevent weight loss. So, that just suggests they do have some limitations.
Researchers determined that some bears had enough fat reserves to survive until the end of November when the sea ice begins to reform in Hudson Bay. But some might not make it that long.
The bears are doing what they've always done, whatever bag of tricks they've had, and they've been using them for probably thousands and thousands of years. It's not going to be enough.
While not all polar bear populations face the same threats, all are classified as a species of special concern in Canada, mainly due to the loss of sea ice. The question that remains is, will this highly resilient species be able to further adapt to the rapidly changing Arctic environment? Nicole Mortillero, CBC News, Toronto.
When you think of Alberta, you probably think of cattle and oil, but another industry may belong on that provincial list, one with a less rugged image than the ranch or the rig. The CBC's Nicholas Frew explains.
It's nice to see that. I just put a smile on my face to see the bees flying around today.
Richard Ozero is one of the hundreds of beekeepers in Alberta, helping the local honey industry blossom. He and his wife Amber built careers in the news business before buying a farm in Parkland County. Today, the couple tends to 4,000 colonies, and their honey is shipped across the continent and overseas.
Alberta honey can make its way all around the world, like all kinds of places. It's nice to see, because we do have a really sought-after product. It's well known for its high quality, its color, how light it is, and the taste and everything.
While the honey industry has not grown to the same scale as wheat or cattle, The federal government estimates honeybees contribute billions to Canada's agriculture sector through pollination.
That connection is huge of the economic importance of honeybees in the country, responsible for pollination for about 21 other crops, depend 100% on honeybees.
Data shows that Alberta is home to the most honeybee colonies in Canada, producing about 40% of the country's honey last year. In 2023, Alberta set a record for honey value, earning more than $105 million. But beekeeping wasn't always the bustling industry it is today in Alberta.
And I think there was a lot of beekeeping operations in the east who were finding themselves a little crowded geographically and realized that there was a lot of territory out in the prairies.
Once established, apiculture grew quickly here, with the number of beekeepers peaking at 11,000 at the end of the Second World War. And interest in beekeeping in Alberta appears to be on the rise once more. The number of beekeepers has steadily increased since 2008. As for those thinking of starting out, experts say it's crucial that each apiculturist educate themselves thoroughly and find a local mentor who can teach them how to care for bees in Alberta's climate. Nicholas Frew, CBC News, Edmonton.
And that is Northbeat for tonight. For news anytime, you can always go to our website, cbc.ca/north. Thank you for watching. I'm Megan Roberts. Have a good night.
Closing this case gets you one step closer to you getting back on the squad and keeping you out of prison.
You're not a detective, you're a con artist. You have a driver's license, right?
Of course, I have 9. If you couldn't be a cop, what would you be?
Nothing. My dad raised me to be a cop. That's who I am. Stay here.
You're adorable.
You guys are making this entire station look like a circus.
He's busy trying to solve a murder. What are you doing?
Thanks for having my back.
Look at you.
Is this your girlfriend? This is not my girlfriend. She's way too cool to be your girlfriend. She's not way too cool to be my girlfriend.
My name is Amanda Paris, and I am constantly thinking about culture, race, and social issues. So I want to push these conversations forward.
We found that there was animal meat fat in plastic synthetic hair.
There was a time where I'm like, should I have kids because the kids are going to be black?
I've been fired from my dream job. What's the worst that can happen now?
Now is the time to take the group chat to the real world. A 6-part series. This is For the Culture.
Watch free on CBC Gem.
Hey, you're some friends, aren't you? Stand here and now you try and blackmail her. You disgust me. Every one of you.
Coronation Street. Watch free on CBC Gem.
We've won the costume contest every year.
Bunny!
Oh, they're squishing me. What have we done?
You can be this happy too with endless TV shows, movies, and more.